Morning, everyone. So my name is Lien Bui, and I'm a patient and public advisor at the NIHR RSS and Specialist Centre for Public Health at the University of Southampton. So I will be joined today by my colleague, Megan, and we're going to talk to you about working with people and community. So over to Megan.
Hi everyone. My name's Megan Barlow-Pay and I work with Leanne as a public involvement advisor for the RSS and the Specialist Centre. Just before Leanne kicks off, we did just want to acknowledge some of the different terminology that's used when we'll be talking about patient and public involvement and working with people and communities today. Obviously, our presentation is called Working with People and Communities. This is a term that's being used increasingly by NIHR to talk about that kind of partnership working that researchers do with service users and the public. And when we talk about it, we will kind of interchangeably use working with people and communities and patient and public involvement. And we do mean the same thing in principle. We will be talking about those broad principles of working in collaboration with people affected by research. So just to say, you'll hear us say both, but we do mean the same thing in case that's going to cause any confusion.
So we will be delivering two sections today. So in the first section, I would like to talk about the what, who, and why of patient and public involvement, or PPI. And Megan is going to talk to you about planning your PPI costings, PPI delivery, and PPI support available, which is more practical. Right, so first of all, I would like to discuss briefly about what PPI is. So public involvement in research, or people and communities, as we sometimes refer to, means working with or by members of the public rather than conducting research to, about, or for them. This approach ensures that research is more relevant, ethical, and impactful. So why it matters, involving the public helps researchers understand real-world concerns, improves the quality and accessibility of research, and also builds trust between researchers and communities. And I would like to give some examples of involvement. So members of the public can help, for example, identify which topics matter most to them, ensuring research aligns with community needs. Public contributors could also offer valuable insights into how studies are structured, making them more practical and inclusive. They could also help create clear and understandable documents, for example, patient information leaflets and planning summaries, which help improve communications and accessibility. Public members could also take part in decision making throughout the research process, offering ongoing feedback and guidance to the research team. So basically, public involvement is not just a box ticking exercise, it's a meaningful partnership that enhances the relevance and quality of research. So now I would like to talk about who PPI is. So it's important to understand that people involved in patient public involvement, or PPI, are not research participants. Their role is basically different. They work with researchers to share and improve the research process. This might include advising on study design, reviewing materials, or helping researchers interpret findings. They are collaborators, not subjects of the research. So participants take part in the research itself, for example, by completing surveys, undergoing treatments, or being observed. And their data is collected and analyzed as part of the study. In other words, PPI is about partnership and co-production, co-creation. It's not data collection. So recognizing this can help ensure respectful and meaningful involvement. When we talk about the public, in the context of public involvement in research, we are referring to a broad and inclusive group, not just the patients. So as you can see on the slide, we have three different groups. So the first group include patients and potential patients. So this includes anyone who is currently receiving care or may do so in the future. Their lived experiences and perspectives are essential for shaping research that is relevant and meaningful. In the second group, we have carers and people who use health and social care services. So carers often have more unique insights into the challenges and the needs of those that they care for. Including them ensures that research reflects the realities of both the service users and those who care for them. In the third group, we have people from organizations that represent service users. These might be advocacy groups, charities, or community organizations. They bring collective voices, and they could also help ensure that underrepresented or marginalized groups are included in the research conversation. So public involvement is about engaging with a wide range of people who have valuable perspectives, not just those with direct patient experience. So why PPI matters in research? Public involvement is rooted in democratic values. It respects the right of people to have a say in research that affects their lives. By involving the public, we also strengthen the ethical integrity of our work, ensuring transparency, accountability, and fairness throughout the whole research process. And people with lived experience bring insights that researchers might not have considered before. Their perspectives help researchers identify real-world priorities, challenges, and outcomes that truly matter to communities. So this diversity enriches the research and also makes it more inclusive. Public representatives can also help refine research questions, improve study design, and make the research materials clearer and more accessible. Their input can also support better recruitment and retention of participants, and also improves how we communicate with those involved in the research study. So when research is shaped by those it aims to serve, it becomes more meaningful. Public involvement ensures that our work addresses issues that matter to patients, carers, and service users. This increases the chances that our findings will be used in practice or policy. And last but not least, funders like the NIHR expect researchers to involve the public meaningfully. It's not just a box-ticking exercise, as we discussed earlier. It's about co-producing research that reflects real needs. And public involvement demonstrates a commitment to inclusive, patient-centered approach, which is increasingly valued across the sector. Right, so now I would like to introduce to you a research cycle which is created by Louis Ting, a public contributor. So as you can see here, there are different stages within a research cycle, and patient and the public could get involved in different stages within this research cycle. So for example, from the very beginning, which is identifying research priorities, public contributors can help define what matters most to patients and communities, and they could also help ensure research is grounded in lived experience and real-world needs. In designing the study, public contributors could provide input on practical and inclusive study design. They could also give advice on equality, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI. So when developing study protocols, PPI representatives can also review participant-facing materials like consent forms, information, patient information sheet, and they could also ensure the clarity and accessibility and relevance of those documents. In terms of conducting the study, they could participate in advisory or steering groups in which they provide feedback to support ethical and participant-friendly delivery of research. Analyzing data, in this stage, PPI contributors could help define outcome measures that matter to patients, and they may also be able to assist in interpreting findings from a public perspectives. In terms of dissemination, public contributors can help shape how findings are communicated to the public. They could help to review the planning lecture summaries, make sure that it's clear and accessible to the wider audience. And they may also be able to co-present at conferences or co-author publications. In terms of implementation, public contributors could provide insights into how findings can be applied in real-world settings, and they could help identify barriers and facilitators to uptake in communities or services. Regarding evaluation of the research, PPI representatives can look for feedback on the research process and also its impact. They could help assess whether the research met its goals and also whether the research was meaningful to those involved. So basically, PPI is not a one-time activity, is a partnership that spans the entire research cycle, and involving patients and the public at every stage could help enhance the relevance, quality, and impact of research. Right, so on this slide, I would like to discuss the latter of patient and public involvement. So as you can see, we have 5 different levels of patient and public involvement in research. And I'll start from the bottom where involvement is minimal. And then I will move up to the most collaborative approach of patient and public involvement, which is the top one, the devolving. So starting from informing, which is the bottom level, this is about providing accessible and transparent information to patients and the public. Examples could include newsletters, study updates, and lay summaries of research findings. It is very important for transparency in research, but it's just a one-way process. So information flows from researchers to the public. The next level is consulting, which is number 4. Here, researchers seek feedback from patients and the public on specific aspects of research, such as study design or findings. So this often happens through surveys or public consultations. Why valuable is still limited because the public doesn't really share decision-making power with researchers and her research team. Moving up, we have involvement, which is very familiar to many of you here. This means embedding patient and public perspectives in research design and delivery. For example, researchers could invite them to join advisory panels, or they could contribute to funding applications. Their input influences decisions, but researchers still lead the process. And next one, we will move on to co-production. This is a true partnership where patients and the public work alongside researchers at every stage, from designing studies, setting priorities, and developing protocols. It's collaborative and it ensures research reflects lived experience. And at the top level, we have devolving. This is the highest levels of involvement, where decision-making power is placed directly in the hands of patients and the public. For example, patient-led research projects or full co-production of studies. So here, the community leads and researchers support. So those levels show a spectrum from informing to consulting, involvement, co-production, and then at the top level is devolving, where the degree of power and partnership increases as we move up. Right. So far in the first section of our presentation today, I have covered firstly the what, who, and why of PPI. I also discussed different ways in which patient and the public could get involved in different stages of a research cycle, as well as 5 different levels of the ladder of patient and public involvement. Now, my colleague Megan will talk to you about practical aspects of planning, organizing, and delivering PPI activities with more specific examples to hopefully help you plan for your PPI in your research projects. So over to you, Megan.
So yeah, thank you so much, Leanne. That was brilliant and a really useful scene setting to help us think about why patient and public involvement is so important. So one of the things that myself and the PPI team within the RSS experience quite a lot when we're advising and supporting researchers and people that have perhaps not done patient and public involvement before is there's often a lot of questions about the logistics and how you get going and how you actually start to do patient and public involvement, how you reach out to people and things like that. So this second part of the presentation, I'm really going to focus on some of those practical questions and what it is that you need to be doing in order to reach out to the relevant people and communities to help inform your research. So Leanne has obviously already talked about this a little bit, but just to reflect again on who we should be including in the public involvement work that we're doing. It's there are lots of kind of existing PPI groups out there and patient support groups and things like that, but what you need to start off with is to think about who your population or your people and communities that would be ultimate beneficiaries of your research would actually be. And your patient and public involvement representatives really need to have some sort of on the ground experience or lived experience or understanding of what the barriers and facilitators, the challenges, issues, potential barriers to participation, future participants might have. So you really do need to think about who that population is. You also need to really consider diverse perspectives. So somebody who is, so the example I have here, a single parent may have very different barriers to a retired person or somebody who's living with a disability, for example, to participate in research. And one of the real useful conversations that you can have with your PPI representatives is to sort of think about what some of those challenges are to participation and to retention, and how you as a researcher can mitigate that and make your research as inclusive and as accessible as possible. It's also important to recognise that some groups are not considered patient and public involvement by NIHR. So, for example, healthcare workers, and I did notice there was a question on this in the chat earlier. So, obviously, depending on your research, it's really, really important that you talk to healthcare workers or healthcare professionals, but they would be considered broader stakeholders rather than patient and public involvement representatives. So in terms of the practicalities of actually how you go about kind of recruiting for and setting up an initial PPI meeting, there's a number of different routes you can go down, and it really is a very project specific decision, and it's one that you kind of need to make based on who it is that you'll be reaching out to and what your sort of ultimate project will be about. I do understand we're talking about pre-docs here, but it's always useful, I think, to think ahead to what that doctoral work will look like, and obviously there is funding within the pre-doc for you to do some of this. So I'm going to just talk through a few different examples of ways in which you may go about identifying and approaching members of the public or people with lived experience who can support your research project. So there'll be existing groups, and depending on who your population is, there may be, for example, a patient support group. So if your area of interest is COPD, there's patient support groups that support patients and their families and carers living with COPD called Breathe Easy. So you might want to approach a patient support group, for example. If your research is on sort of broader health inequalities, for example, you may choose to approach community groups and advocacy groups. There's other more sort of formal ways that you can go around identifying people who perhaps have some previous experience of being involved in research. So there's a website that's actually hosted by NIHR called People in Research, and you can actually post an advert of your proposed research and the PPI that you want to do on that, and members of the public can kind of go on and have a look and see if they've got the relevant lived experience, and then can link with you. If you're in a clinical role, it's okay to reach out to individuals or to put sort of posters up within kind of waiting rooms and things like that, provided that you've got kind of permission from the setting. It's really important if you do that, and when you approach people, that you provide a really clear overview of the project and details of the role and any payment. I think there's often a bit of confusion for people getting involved in research for the first time, and people assume that when you're asking them to be involved, that you might mean participation, so actually to take part as a subject in research. So it's really important to be clear about their role as an advocate for future participants and for patients in general. Once you've identified people, then you need to think about how you're going to work with them. So do you want to have a kind of a group meeting, and would that be better in person, or could it be online? Is it a particularly sensitive topic, or do people have a lot of other priorities in their lives, and therefore scheduling a meeting with lots of people is going to be really difficult? And if so, one-to-one is absolutely fine as well. And again, a one-to-one meeting can be over the telephone, or it can be virtual, or it can be face-to-face. There's a very flexible approach in terms of thinking about what works best for the population that you're trying to involve, and adapting your approaches to meet their needs. Once you've identified some patient and public involvement representatives, and you've identified a time to have a conversation with people, so whether that's one-to-one or whether it's in a group, you need to think about how you're going to run a session. So I've written this as if it's a kind of a group consultation conversation, but same principles can be applied to a conversation with somebody. So I think it's really useful to have a rough agenda with some areas that you and your research will benefit from in terms of input, but also it's really important to allow for flexibility, because what you may find is that patient representatives spot things that you actually hadn't recognised or hadn't considered, and conversations can kind of become quite organic and go in different directions, and that's actually really useful and really helpful, and one of the brilliant things about working with people who have a different perspective to us. I do think having an agenda is useful because it does help you kind of structure the conversation, but again, just allow that conversation to be informal and don't feel like you need to stick to it too rigidly. It is, as always, really, really important when you're working with members of the public to use plain English and to be really clear about roles and expectations. Everybody needs to really understand why they're there. You need to be able to communicate your research and what you're doing in a very, very clear and plain way so that people can understand and they can meaningfully contribute. If you are running a group session, then facilitation skills are really important. So just making sure that everybody there is able to contribute. Some people will be more vocal than others. Some people might feel a bit shy or intimidated. And allowing sort of small breakout sessions and things like that, whatever it might be, to try and encourage participation from everybody is really, really important. And it might be that you want to pair up with a colleague or ask the RSS for some support, and those are options for you to help you think about that. You will need to consider who'll be taking notes, so how you're going to be capturing the feedback, and it's really useful sometimes to use initial meetings as a kind of starting point for future collaboration. So you can talk about your project plans and what you're hoping to do, and then you can also, towards the end of a session, talk about your sort of ongoing plans for involvement should a research project get funded, for example, and whether people would be interested in continuing to support you. So Leon's already discussed inclusivity and representative PPI, and Becky's going to be talking following me, and she's going to give a much more in-depth talk about research inclusion. But just to reiterate, because it is really, really important, to just think about how the people that you're involving are providing you with diverse perspectives. When research is developed and delivered meaningfully with public contributors, it can be a really powerful thing. It can actually help shape research and actually help shape future services to be more appropriate for communities and for populations. But obviously, if only a small sector of society is involved in that process, then actually what we do risk doing is reinforcing health inequalities and developing and refining services that work for one population and not for others. So it is absolutely vital that we do think about who it is we're talking to and how we can ensure that we're getting a broad range of perspectives in the discussions and the conversations that we're having. So, I mean, I've given a little bit of an overview of some of the kind of practical processes that you might want to go through in order to identify, set up and deliver a kind of a relatively generic PPI session. I now want to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the application for the pre-doctoral, but I do want to talk about it in the context of a doctoral award as well, because as you can see here within the application form, part of the pre-doctoral award is funding for patient and public involvement to support the development of a future doctoral fellowship application. So whilst the pre-doctoral award itself is normally a training award and there's often no embedded project, that doesn't mean that public involvement isn't something that should be thought about and should be considered and costed. As well as the up to £1,000 towards patient and public involvement activities, you can also think about your own training and your own development around your skills and knowledge of patient and public involvement and things that you might wish to include as part of any training that you're embedding within this award. So if we have a little think about that £1,000 and what you might consider doing as part of your development for future doctoral fellowships, I wanted to just return to the research cycle, which I know Leon has already talked us through, but as you can see here, I've circled the kind of the key areas, if you like, of the research cycle, which you would probably want to really focus in on in terms of thinking about what do I want to do for my patient and public involvement work within a pre-doctoral award. And the great thing about having a pre-doctoral is it gives you that time and it gives you some additional funds to really work closely and collaboratively with patients and the public to develop and refine a really well considered and potentially co-produced research proposal for a doctoral. So some of the kind of key areas that you might think about focusing on in terms of applying for patient and public involvement funds within the pre-doc will be around the kind of identifying and prioritising. So working with groups and individuals to think about what is the most important kind of questions to be asking in your research field, and exactly what question you're asking, refining that, making sure it's relevant, making sure the outcomes that you're focusing on are outcomes that matter to people, and whether there should be other things that are captured that are perhaps more relevant or more interest to patients than you recognised. The design of the research, so actually thinking about the methodology that you're using and the acceptability of that. Is it going to be appropriate for future participants? What can you do to put in any mitigations around barriers, and how can you think about the kind of retention of participants, and can your PPI representatives work with you around that, and thinking about how you're going to do that in the best way possible. And then what role can they have in actually developing the grant proposal with you? So can they work with you on the lay summary? Can they help make a plan for you for your ongoing PPI work within a doctoral award, for example? And all of that can be embedded into the pre-doc, and it can be work that you do over the course of your pre-doctoral award to kind of really scope out some of these things and really kind of consider exactly what it is that would be a meaningful approach, and ensure that you're kind of really embedding all of this from the very offset. I think it's also, I know the focus today is on pre-doctoral awards, but I think it's important to just reflect quickly on what a doctoral NIHR application form would look like, or other fellowship awards. Because for a lot of you, that's what the pre-doc will be focused on, the sort of development of leading towards this. So when you get to writing an NIHR application doctoral form, there will be a much more emphasis on the people and communities and the patient and public involvement in terms of word count and things like that. And you'll have a standalone section with 3,500 characters where you have to talk about the work that you've done pre-grant. So that would be all of your work that you've done within the pre-doctoral award. So that would be included in the pre-grant for the doctoral, and how your work has helped shape the doctoral award, the doctoral application form, and how it's informed it. You'd also need to provide a kind of overview of your ongoing plans for involvement. The application form will also have a detailed research plan, which asks you to talk again about working in partnership with those affected by your research, so patient and public involvement representatives, and there it would be expected to be embedded within your detailed research plan. So examples of how your PPI representatives will help deliver the research with you and the roles that they will have going forward. And lastly, you'll have a plain English summary, which will be 3,500 characters, which which you can work with PPI representatives to co-write, to refine, whatever it might be. I've summarised this a little bit, but just to quickly reflect on this, the people and communities section will again, I think it's useful to think about this in terms of the context of the pre-doc, because this is what all of that PPI work in the pre-doc is leading to. But the people and community section will ask you about a summary of all your PPI work done to date, and the impact that it's had on the application. So that's really, really important, how that PPI work has actually led to the development and changes and refinement of the application itself. A broad description of who will be involved and how, what their roles will be, and any training, payment, support, mentorship, and things like that that you might need to consider in order to deliver on the patient and public involvement work you're proposing. So in terms of costing for patient and public involvement in your funding applications, so you have up to £1,000 to apply for patient and public involvement work. the review panel will look at these costings and they'll cross-check with the activities that you have planned, and they will sort of make sure that it all kind of makes sense and it all looks like it adds up. There's no set guidelines on costs as such, but there are things that you need to consider. So you may, depending on your population, you may need to consider things like childcare costs. You may need to consider travel costs. You may need to consider carer allowance costs and things like that. Patient and public involvement representatives are expected to be paid. The rate for that is currently £25 an hour. So that would be expected to be reflected in the costs in your application form. The NIHR are really keen to see PPI, and they're really keen to see PPI funded well. So I think it's about kind of being pragmatic and being able to kind of make sort of reasonable decisions about what you think would be an appropriate level of patient and public involvement. It needs to be good value for money, and it needs to be something that you can deliver, but it also needs to be a kind of meaningful programme of work that actually demonstrates that you're committed to doing patient and public involvement, that you're committed to paying your PPI representatives, and it's kind of about kind of striking that balance. Oh, so I've already covered a couple of these, but just to say, here's a few other things that you may wish to consider. So, if you're meeting face to face, you may wish to consider a venue hire, a venue which you would need to hire, and also refreshments. So it might be that the meeting falls at a lunchtime, in which case you might want to offer sandwiches, or if it's just in the morning or afternoon, at least tea and coffee and biscuits or fruit or something like that. Translation services and interpreters. Now, I think this is quite an important one, especially when we're thinking about the sort of research inclusion agenda. And again, depending on your population, in order for you to be speaking to the right people, it may be that you need to consider whether or not you need to ask a translator to support your patient and public involvement work, to allow those that don't speak English to contribute. And in terms of your sort of longer term PPI work, and if you have a PPI group that support you in the future, then they may need some training. So you may wish to consider some costs around courses and training for your PPI representatives. People often ask us how much should I cost for PPI? And it's very, very difficult to answer because it really depends on your project and what you're doing. So there is no one size fits all. You can't just come up with a generic cost for patient and public involvement activities. You have to work backwards from your plan. So you have to know, first of all, what it is, what role your patient and public involvement your patient and public involvement representatives are going to have. And once you know what role they're going to have and what they're going to be actually doing, then you can work out what the cost is. So if they're going to be meeting, for example, every 6 months for 2 hours, then you work out the cost of that. You work out what an hour of pre-reading might be. You work out what travel expenses might be. You work out if there's a couple of extra meetings you need, looking at your Gantt chart, whether there's a couple of extra meetings that you may need around a particular part of a research project, where you feel like they may have additional roles and you could benefit from some further input from them, then you cost that in. So the first thing you need to do is work out what it is you want patient and public involvement representatives to do in order to meaningfully support you, and then you can work out the costings. So in terms of pre-grant PPI activities, obviously the pre-grant for the NIHR doctoral award will be something that's kind of covered by your pre-doc award and your £1,000 there, so you have quite a good budget there to work with. if you wanted to do some patient and public involvement work in the lead up to your pre-doc, then some of the RSSs, so for example, we do provide a here we go, an award that you can apply for to cover the costs of some sort of pre-grant PPI work. So it's up to £350, and you would have to request support from us at the RSS to access that, and it would be offered as part of a package of support for us. But that is something that we can explore with you, whether it would be appropriate in the development of a pre-doctoral award. I've just skipped forward a couple of slides. Just a reflection on some of the specifics of an NIHR Fellowship Award. In some of the other NIHR awards, you may know that PPI representatives can be co-applicants, and you actually have a team member who's the PPI lead who has a dedicated role to deliver on PPI. Now, it's slightly different within fellowships, and that's because it's a personal award, and you as an individual will be leading on the whole programme of work. So for both the pre-doc and a doctoral, the awardee, so the applicant yourself, will lead on any PPI work, and that would need to be done by you. You wouldn't have another team member who did that for you. You can work with others. So, for example, you could work with charities to help support identifying PPI representatives. You can work with PPI contributors kind of closely throughout the delivery of a project as a collaborator. They wouldn't be a co-applicant because you don't have co-applicants within fellowships, but they can collaborate with you and be a named individual in the application form that supports you throughout the course of the fellowship. In terms of putting your grants together and the support that's available, so there are a number of different RSS hubs. We're kind of here from Southampton and Partners. The support offered at all of the different hubs may vary slightly. So this is what we offer within Southampton, although it would be very similar if you were to go to one of our other colleagues across the country. But we, as a PPI team, we will meet with researchers kind of one-to-one, and we'll talk through their project, their research plan, what they are hoping to do. We will advise and support them to kind of think about exactly what the best approach to patient and public involvement might be. We obviously have our public involvement and engagement resource, our peer award, which is £350. We can review and read over drafts of the application if that's helpful, and provide feedback as you're sort of drafting and as you're writing. And we can also help actually set up and facilitate PPI activities. If that's something that you need and you would like, then discuss that with us, and we can see if that's something that we can support. So just to reflect back on the Public Involvement and Engagement Resource Award again, this is actually a slightly out of date infographic here, so apologies for that. That says £300 on it, whereas it should be £350. But as you can see here, there is a kind of process for the peer award, and that very much is that process is very much around working with us within the PPI team to help sort of shape and ensure you're doing the very best PPI, pre-grant PPI work that you possibly can be doing. So it really is part of a package of support. Again, if that is something you're interested in, do put in a request for support, and you'll be directed to the PPI team, and we can work with you to talk through what the process is and to talk about your proposal and what the best kind of approach is. Now, I have 10 minutes left, and I wasn't sure whether I would have time to do a case study, but I will whiz through it quite quickly. Just to acknowledge that this isn't a fellowship, and I apologise for that, but hopefully it's a useful depiction anyway of some of the approaches that you can use in the identification and undertaking of patient and public involvement work, and the ways in which that it can inform a project. And hopefully we'll kind of just bring it all to life for you a little bit. It's not on fellowship, but the principles will be exactly the same in terms of the involvement process and the impact that involving can that can have on a research project. So this particular case study was an NIHR public health research project, which I was co-applicant on, and the title was very long and was called Gateway, a randomised controlled trial economic and qualitative evaluation to examine the effectiveness of an out-of-court community-based gateway intervention programme aimed at improving health and wellbeing for young adult offenders, victim satisfaction and reducing recidivism. So, just to provide a bit more context for exactly what that project was about, I've done a PICO for you here because I think that's probably the most useful way of thinking about it. So the population was young adults 18 to 24 who had been arrested for and accepted responsibility for crime in Southampton. There was a particular criteria of crime that they had to fall within. So, for example, they can be violent or sexual crimes. The intervention was a program called Gateway. So it was a 16-week program of support, which was delivered through one-to-one sessions and group work, and it aimed to support some of the broader known influences of offending behaviour. So things like homelessness or access to education and things like that, and drugs and alcohol use. And then the group work was aimed at sort of building kind of self-confidence and self-esteem and those kind of areas. The usual care, so the control group was the control was usual care, so going through the court system and whatever would have been the outcome of that. So it was a randomized control trial, and that may have been a fine, it may have been a prison sentence, it could have been anything, whatever the outcome of that was. And then the outcomes were around self-reported measures, so things like health and well-being, drugs and alcohol use and mental health. And then also we were collecting recidivism, so 5-year routine data around reoffending rates. So in order to set up a PPI meeting, it was really important that we were able to talk to people that had some lived experience of the criminal justice system. It wouldn't have been any good for us to go to a sort of generic PPI group that was running in a hospital of volunteers, because actually what we really needed to do was understand from the perspective of young adults who were kind of caught up in the justice system, what their barriers to participation, what their kind of priorities and things like that were. So we knew that we didn't have the skills to necessarily identify those people. So we partnered with a charity called Hampton Trust, and Hampton Trust deliver a lot of kind of rehabilitation programs and support for families of people that are incarcerated. So we worked really closely. What they were able to do was invite us along to some of their workshops, so workshops that they were delivering for people who'd been convicted of crimes, where they were doing sort of rehabilitation programs, things like that. And we sort of attended some of these workshops, and we spent a little bit of time with people. And at the end of the workshop, they invited the participants of the workshops to stay and talk to us if they wished. So it was kind of an open invitation. Feel free to go home now, or if you want to stay and talk to these researchers from the university, stick around for the next hour. We were paying people in shopping vouchers, so that was a kind of incentive for them to stay. And we did quite a few sessions like that, and we were able to talk to quite a wide range of people from different backgrounds who were all who all had very different experiences and were able to provide us some sort of insight into the way that we were planning the research and the acceptability of the research. Specifically, what we wanted to understand was things like potential barriers to recruitment. We knew that it would be a really challenging population to recruit in, and so we wanted to understand what we could do to best kind of mitigate that. We wanted to ensure that we were capturing the right outcomes, so we'll be looking at the things that are the most important to people. We wanted to understand what the concerns for people taking part might be and the best way to share information to the study participants. So the key feedback that we got, and this was all in the pre-grant phase, so this was in the lead up to the application going in. So again, this would be the kind of work that you might be doing within your pre-doctoral work. So the key feedback that we got from our meetings were around outcomes, specifically looking at mental health and well-being, were really, really important to service users. And they were also really keen to see outcomes that they kind of could see the really kind of tangible benefit on their lives, so things like employment or housing status and things like that, so that very kind of clear benefit if there's a change in, homelessness to being homed. There was a lot of distrust of the police, and this was kind of the main perceived barrier to recruitment, and it was a concern that the university team, so we were partnering with the police because we needed to partner with the police in order to deliver the research, but it was a concern that the university team and the police would be kind of seen as interchangeable and part of the same team. So we really, really needed to think about how we would kind of identify ourselves as separate and really try and be clear that, data is anonymized and not shared and things like that. There were issues raised around the location, so this was all an in-person data collection, and we had to kind of identify a few various different community locations that we thought we would ask people to come to in order to collect their kind of quality of life measures and things like that, and the things that we needed to collect. And what we hadn't appreciated was the fact that some people from particular areas of the city wouldn't travel into other areas of the city, and there were, for want of a better word, kind of like kind of pockets of sort of gang culture, and people wouldn't kind of go into different areas. So we needed to be really, really mindful of making sure that we were able to go to people in community spaces that they felt safe and they felt like they could go to. I've already alluded to this, but privacy and data sharing was a huge concern. So we would need to be really, really clear about that fact that we would not be sharing, say, for example, drug use, we wouldn't be sharing that back with the police. And also the feedback was that leaflets and written information, so patient information sheets and things like that, were just not going to be acceptable or really, accessible, and kind of wouldn't work in terms of ensuring informed consent. So we needed to rethink that process. So that was all really, really useful, and that all helped us kind of think about how we were going to do the project, and how we would kind of shape our recruitment and things like that. So we then, just to reflect on our sort of ongoing plans for patient and public involvement throughout the course of the project, we had a collaborator who was an individual who identified himself as, he talked about himself as an ex-offender. He was now a kind of a peer mentor for young adults in the justice system, but he joined the management committee and continued to give advice throughout. And just leading on from some of the feedback in the previous slide, the example of the patient information sheets not being accessible, he actually worked with us and co-designed a recruitment video, and we were able to get that produced, and we had a video instead of, or as well as a patient information sheet, which talked potential participants through the research. And Aaron, his name was, he was working with us. Aaron actually helped us write that and starred in it, and that was fantastic. We continued ad hoc involvement, so we recognised that the young adults at Hampton Trust, the charity, were not that, you know, that a lot of them had kind of chaotic lives, and there was a lot of kind of other competing priorities and challenges for them, and they didn't necessarily want to join a PPI advisory group, and we absolutely recognise that. So we decided to do ad hoc involvement, and we continued to use the same process where we would go along to existing sessions, and that meant that we didn't necessarily speak to the same people each time, but that was fine, and that ended up being in a kind of appropriate way of getting really broad involvement. We worked with a PPI representative from a charity who supported victims to ensure that we had victim involvement, and we also did a kind of broader community involvement element of work, which was focused on having a kind of range of consultations with local community groups and kind of really trying to unpick the public's views around the intervention and what outcomes were important to local communities as well, and how we can kind of make sure we're addressing any concerns.